So I'm going to answer this question. Was there a moment in high school that made you think, yes, I want to pursue this field of study, which I think in my case, art history? And the answer is no, because art history was not taught in my high school. I don't think that it is regularly taught in art in high school. So the point here is that there are many fields of studies that you have not at all been exposed to as a high school student, and college is a wonderful time to try out different things that you have never studied before, because who knows, it might lead to a future professional career like it did in my case. Hello, my name is Noriko Murai. I am professor of art history in the Faculty of Liberal Arts at Sophia University. For the next half an hour or so, I would like to talk to you about the impact of Japanese culture on modern Western art. More specifically, I would like to give a little lecture about the impact of Japanese culture on modern Western art in the late 19th and early 20th century, so late 1800s to around early 1900s. In terms of Japanese history, that time period corresponds to the end of the Tokugawa era, which ended in 1867, and the ensuing Meiji era. As cultural phenomena, there was a widespread fashion for things Japanese known as Japonisme. The word Japonisme comes from the French term Japon, Japan, and ism, and Japonisme. So this is the learning goals for today's lecture. These are the three things that if you can understand by the end of the lecture, I would consider that I did a pretty good job. So those would be: first, I would like you to know a little bit about how the modern West appropriated visual arts of Japan in order to modernize its own art and design. And second, this phenomena produced an influential image of Japan in the modern West that continues to this day. And third, Japan in turn has appropriated the means to make it as its own, that Western image of Japan as its own self-image, and has largely benefited diplomatically, economically, and culturally. In other words, a kind of something like soft power from its reputation as an artistic nation. So what I mean is something like this. Here you're looking at the cover of a magazine called Le Japon Artistique that was published in French, but also English and German by the German-born art dealer active in Paris, Siegfried Bing, between 1888 and 1891. He was a dealer of Asian objects and also operated an interior design gallery called La Maison de l'Art Nouveau in Paris. So this magazine cover exemplifies one of the most enduring images of Japan in the West, which is to say, image of Japan as artistic, as the journal title says, Japan Artistic. And it especially the popular Edo culture of woodblock prints that represents Japanese art. And within it, as you can see here, the famous serialized prints showing Mount Fuji designed by Katsushika Hokusai. So these two are the original prints from the series 36 Views of Mount Fuji, serialized in 1831 and 34. So that you could see that these images that I think many of you recognize today as something coming from traditional Japanese culture was in the late 19th century, as you can see on the magazine cover, representing this image of Japan as artistic. And the point I want to make here is that this image is still something that you can see today. For example, in 2020, the Japanese government updated the passport design, Japanese passports, and I don't have that, but apparently if you have it, if you open it, the page design has a pattern of this Hokusai's famous prints on passport designs. So you could see how that to this day, these are images that even the national government of Japan represents as exemplar of our national culture. So we can say that the self-image of Japan, as Hokusai's print shows, that the process of shaping one's national cultural self-identity is in fact a cross-cultural process. So national self-image of Japan is not just about Japan presenting to itself and to the outside what it thinks it is. It's equally, as I have explained, about Japan adapting as its own self-image what non-Japan has historically identified as distinctive and attractive about Japan. So you might think that the process is something like this, that there was Hokusai, he made this famous print, and then slightly later, a European person picked it up and said that, oh, that's a representative of Japan, and that it has become, by now, one of the most recognizable images of Japanese culture. But in fact, it's not like that. What's more accurately is this, that, there was, of course, Hokusai's prints that was, that was popular in Japan itself. But more than that, a European person recognized it and said, hey, this is really cool. This is Japan. Japan is this place that creates creative images like this. Then modern Japan said that, oh, that's what the West thinks is interesting and important about our artistic heritage. We shall adapt it as something that's also important to define who we think we are, and now it has become one of the most recognizable images of Japanese culture. What I just want to emphasize here is that this is not just one-way street, but it is cross-cultural process. So, and as another example, I would like to talk a little bit about the work of James McNeill Whistler. As I wrote here, one of the most important and also among the earliest painters to incorporate Japanese art and aesthetics into his art. Here you're looking at an image of his himself in his studio. You could see him underneath one of the paintings he has. We have two visitors to the studio, women, one of them wearing something that resembles maybe kimono or Japanese robe. She is holding uchiwa fan, and behind the lady in white dress sitting on the couch, you see shelves with pottery in blue and white. That's probably Chinese porcelain, perhaps including some Japanese works also. So Whistler was an American-born artist, but he was active in Paris and then later in London. So cosmopolitan person himself. And as I wrote here, he was one of the first painters to really integrate Japanese aesthetics into his art. But interestingly enough, he was not necessarily interested in Japan per se. For example, although he could have, if he really wanted to, come to Japan, but he did not travel to Japan. He was also not necessarily interested in Japanese culture, like, studying Japanese language, etc. He was also equally interested in Chinese porcelain. So the nuanced differences between Chinese and Japanese culture, it's not something that interested him. I think on the whole, he was interested in the objects from Japan and China and extracting some aesthetic principles out of them. Whether what that meant in the original cultural context of Japan or China did not interest him too much. Because the reason why he was interested in East Asian art was largely to create something that for him represent new modern painting. He was a defiant artist who wanted to rebel against the conventional practices of painting at the time, and for that purpose, to achieve artistic modernity that he can claim as his own, he selectively incorporated East Asian aesthetics into his art. So this is one famous painting by Whistler, The Princess from the Land of Porcelain. The Land of Porcelain, where is that? Is that a fantasy land? Is it something that perhaps references China as a place that was the famous maker of porcelain? It is a large painting. And despite the title, it is in fact meant to be a portrait of an actual person named Christine Sparlatti. She was a famous beauty. She was known as an Anglo-Greek beauty at the time. So, he was commissioned to create this portrait of her. But the result, the family was not happy, especially the father. So he decided, I'm not going to pay for this painting. Whistler still showed it at the Paris Salon in 1865. And it was considered to be a very odd work. I will talk about the later history a little bit later, but father decided not to buy it. But later it was purchased by somebody else named Leland in London. And he was going to hang it in his dining room, where he had a famous display of Chinese porcelain collection. So that the whole idea of Princess from the Land of Porcelain, I think he thought would be a good fit for his dining scheme. Now, why was this odd? Because maybe for us today, it might not look as odd. So if you compare it to other celebrated portraits of 19th century France, that it was first exhibited in France, by comparing Whistler's painting to images like the one by Ingres on the right, you could see the differences, right? Because the Ingres painting, a portrait, you could really see the individual features of the sitter. You can really distinguish her flesh, her face, and then other kind of materials like clothing, different kind of textures, etc. You could place her in this illusion of pictorial space with the background. Where's the one on the left by Whistler? Everything is painted in sort of similarly. You can really distinguish the face of the sitter from the rest, the background, the folding screen paintings, and maybe the painted fans in the background, the carpet in the foreground, the robe that she is wearing. All of that, in a way, kind of takes over the interest of the painting. And her own face is small and is not really the feature of the painting. And that really was not what was expected from a portrait painting at the time. And she's also kind of strangely narrow and slanking, perhaps in depicting her Whistler model itself after examples of Japanese paintings, such as the Hanging Scroll by Hokusai. Maybe not this particular painting, but something like that. So the whole thing for the European contemporary viewer seemed odd. Now, this is another example by Whistler, a much smaller painting, but from around the same time, another Japanese style painting. So this too, I think, gives us insight to how Whistler was trying to modernize his own painting practice by incorporating East Asian and especially Japanese elements. Here it's kind of like a strange fantasy composite scene. In the foreground, we see I think a contemporary European woman, although the faces are depicted in a kind of blurry way, so you cannot really tell the ethnic features of these specific models very much. But they're wearing a Japanese-style kimono in the foreground. There's maybe Japanese-looking a flower. One of the ladies seems to be playing shamisen. There seems to be something that looks like sake. There's somebody who's also holding a fan. So it looks kind of like a played-out Japanese scene. And the balcony too, the wooden lattice, looks like it could be maybe part of something that might be depicted in a Japanese woodblock print. But the landscape that they're looking at, the river and beyond, is clearly one of contemporary London. Across the river, you could see sort of chimney and sort of smoke coming out, industrialized London. So you could see what Whistler was trying to do is to create a contemporary modern scene, but viewed from this idiosyncratic perspective or a kind of vision of the artist, to see London as if you're looking at Japanese woodblock prints or Japanese paintings. This is another famous painting by Whistler slightly later. Here you don't really see any overt Japanese motif like kimono or other things, but this impossibly tall bridge that would have struck the viewer as reminiscent of woodblock prints from Japan at the time. The exaggerated perspective, so foreground so big, background so small, the prominence of blue and green tones. All of that, again, would have struck a Japanese tone to viewers in London at the time. And this too, like the last one, is really about a scene of London. Across that the river again, you see nighttime London, industrialized gas lights, things like that. So you could see here what I guess kind of culmination of Whistler's incorporation of Japanese aesthetics, that he was trying to create a painting that was not really an illusion, a naturalistic pictorial illusion that you would see. Rather, he wanted to create something that the viewer would kind of look at it as a painted surface and appreciate it as painted surface, arrangement of forms, pigments, things like that. So he might have been looking at something like this, for example, among other things. Now I want to show you another aspect of Japonisme, looking at export wear from Japan and how different objects from Japan came to shape the image of Japan and also modern design in the West. So as I wrote here, Japan had been producing export porcelain, lacquer, and other luxurious wear for wealthy Europeans, in fact, throughout the Edo period. So it's not something that began in the Meiji period. And collectively, things like this. These are export porcelain from the Tokugawa period that was already collected in Europe by the end of the 19th century. So it was already creating the image of Japan as a land of well-crafted objects, because porcelain continued to be a luxurious object for much of Europeans. And I think what happened in the late 19th century is just the volume of this export wear increased tremendously. And more they were becoming available for purchase, not just for the most elite classes of the society, but more broadly to middle-class consumers in Europe and also in North America. So object like this on the left is a well-made porcelain from the Meiji period. Many of these things, hundreds, thousands of them, were exported to Western market in the late 19th century. So with Japan's resumption of diplomacy and open trade with Western powers at the end of the Tokugawa shogunate rule, the export of Japanese objects to the West, from potteries such as this one, there were a number of lacquerware, there are a lot of metalware, there are different kinds of textile, all grew exponentially, resulting in a fad for things Japanese. This is another example. This was something that was collected by a British person who lived in Tokyo in the Meiji period. So both collected within Japan and purchased as export wares outside. More and more things were sort of flooding, things from Japan were flooding the West. So more than perhaps people, because travel, not many Japanese people traveled to the West at the time. It's really the objects that shaped the perception of Japan and what Japanese culture might look like at the time. And these things had a big impact on modernizing design, product design in the West also. This is a really cool looking example. Surprising, it's from the late 19th century, but it was designed by the English designer Christopher Dresser, very much inspired by objects from East Asia, including Japan. Slightly later, this is one of the examples that was made for the Tiffany glass company, and the Tiffany company still exists today. And this kind of style was known as Art Nouveau, or simply New Art in French. It was a cosmopolitan and international modern design movement that emerged from the confluence of different cultural references. So it's not just Japan, but Japan was a big ingredient of this modern design movement that was taking place around the end of the 19th century. So how does this field of study, art history, impact and transform the society and the individuals who live in it? I think the answer to this question is very complex. I'm just going to maybe keep to the very simple point. First is that visual expressions is very powerful tool to communicate ideas. So even if you're not going to become an artist, to understand and to be able to interpret visually coded messages is a very powerful skill for anybody living in the 21st century, as we live in a world saturated in visual images. And second, history is important because it is not just what's happening today, but there's a reason why things exist the way they do today. So the historical part of it is also something that I think is actually very important for us to know. Now I want to go back to the painting by Whistler. I did not maybe say that before, but it is a large painting that is today in the collection of the Freer Gallery of Art, which is a part of the National Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. So to tell you a little bit about the history of the object, what happens to it, because I left you by saying that, the painting was rejected by the family. So the father did not want to buy it. And it went through a few hands, but ultimately it was sold to the wealthy ship owner, Frederick Leland, to be displayed in his London home in the 1870s. So as I wrote here, he wanted this to be the centerpiece of his dining room, to be designed in the so-called Anglo-Japanese style. And there was a designer, Thomas Jekyll, who was designing it. But the plan was going on, but he fell ill before the whole room was designed. So then the painter himself, Whistler, took that decoration into his own hands and completed in 1877 in Leland's absence. And he presented that result to the patron, Mr. Leland. The harmony in blue and gold, the Peacock Room. And this is what the result looked like. And the patron really did not like it. He was completely shocked by what he did. This really went beyond what he designed, he assigned the original designer to do. I think what was especially infuriating was Whistler, without his permission, painted in this kind of a bluish green or greenish blue over some really expensive red leather and other things. So in his opinion, it really destroyed some of the best parts of his own dining room. This is other parts of it, so you could see for Whistler's vision, he was very consistent. This was harmony and blue and gold with his own Princess from the Land of Porcelain at the, as the centerpiece, and displaying still, the porcelain collection of Mr. Leland. Well, this is another, the opposite end of that room. In fact, during the dispute that ensued between his patron, Whistler painted this image of two fighting peacocks and entitled it Art and Money, or the Story of the Room. So this room really became one big mess. So after years of dispute, because Leland she didn't want to have anything to do with it. Whistler spent a lot of money. He was not paid for that. He went to debt, etc. So, and then after the death of both of these men, finally, the Detroit, so American railroad car industrialist named Charles Lang Freer, he decided to buy the whole room from Leland's heir in 1904 and ship the whole thing to the U.S. So Freer himself was a major collector of Whistler, and what he was trying to do, among other things, was to repatriate his Whistler's art back to his native country of the U.S. As I told you before, Whistler was American, but he was active largely in Europe, in Paris and London. But Whistler, but by buying back many of his painting, he was trying to remake the image of this painter as an American painter. So the Peacock Room was an important part of this remaking of Whistler back to becoming an American artist. And he was also perhaps better known as a major collector of Asian art. He collected many pieces of Japanese art, Chinese art, and also ancient Persian art and some Egyptian art. His consultants included famous connoisseurs of Japanese art, such as Ernest Fenollosa. So the Peacock Room first was installed in Mr. Freer's residence in Detroit, Michigan, made in this vernacular American shingle style somewhere. This building now belongs to a university. But in 1906, he decided that he wanted to donate his entire collection, including Whistler's art, other American artists, and also, in his own words, very fine examples of Oriental, Egyptian, and sorry for the misspelling, Near Eastern fine arts to the nation, and to establish it as a separate gallery, his own museum of the Smithsonian Institute. So he's like, I'll give you all my collections. Please basically create a national gallery in my name. And President at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, in fact, accepted this gift of Freer to the nation. So then the museum opened its door to the public in 1923. By the time he himself was already dead, but it opened as part of the National Mall in DC. And today, because you could visit, these photographs are contemporary photographs of the Peacock Room. It's today the National Museum of Asian Art, along with the later edition called Arthur Sackler Gallery. So, if you go to DC, if you visit the US, you could visit this art gallery and especially see the Peacock Room if you like. Okay, so I want to go back and just kind of recap what we discussed today. We began with this image of Le Japon artistique, looking at the beginning of how we began to think of Japanese culture by through the image of images like they were both prints by Hokusai, and then we looked at Western art, of course, looking at how Japanese art was selectively incorporated into the making of Western modern art, as you can see here. We also look at the Princess from the Land of Porcelain and the making of the Peacock Room. We also looked at the phenomena of a major export of craftsware, porcelain, metalware, etc. out of Japan into the West, and how that really created the first, most influential image of what Japanese art looks like to outside Japan, and how that too was really integrated into the beginning, the formation of modern design movement such as Art Nouveau, and some aspects of that is now commemorated in a national museum, for example, in the US at the Freer Gallery. So just in this lecture, it was about the impact of Japanese culture on modern Western art in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Some of the things I wanted you to walk away from, if you're still here watching this video, is that you know that the modern West appropriated visual arts of Japan in order to modernize its own art and design. And you can say, okay, I understand something about that. You can also say that, yes, I understand that this phenomena produced an influential image of Japan in the modern West that continues to this day. And finally, I think Japan has largely benefited from its reputation as an artistic nation, and that it did appropriate the Western image of Japan as its own self-image in the process of kind of cross-cultural exchanges of images and imagination that I talked about at the beginning. So thank you very much for listening, and maybe if you have more questions, come to my class, okay, one day. Thank you. So why did I decide to pursue this field of study, art history? The answer is a little bit superficial. I really had wonderful college professors when I was in college. They were so smart and so interesting, and they made me look at objects, images in a way that was not at all possible before. So I felt that was very eye-opening, and each had a very interesting story that they created for themselves. So all of that was very transformative and inspirational, and that is, there's not much of a kind of scholarly reason, but that really was the initial, I think, reason why I thought that I wanted to study more about art history.